No storage unit. No backup plan. Just one backpack and a one-way ticket. From Lisbon cafes to Bolivia's salt flats, she built a life on less and found more. Now, she works from anywhere, spends half what she used to, and wakes up debt-free. Her secret? Living with intention, not just location. Speech Balloon watched the full story. I sold everything at 39. It began with a sound she never thought could mean freedom. A small, hollow clink, metal on wood. Sarah Whitfield stood in the middle of her apartment kitchen, holding a ring of keys. They were heavier than she remembered, not because of the half-dozen brass and silver shapes dangling from the loop, but because of everything they represented. The apartment key with its jagged teeth and dull shine, worn smooth from a decade of turning in the lock. The storage unit key, the one she had once thought of as security, but now understood was a silent drain, keeping her tethered to objects she hadn't touched in years. The tiny, flat silver mailbox key that had unlocked birthday cards, utility bills, and those catalogs she never asked for but always flipped through anyway. They sat there in her palm, warm from her skin, before she placed them onto the worn oak table with that single, final clink. The morning light streamed through the blinds in narrow, golden bars, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. She noticed them for the first time in years. All those mornings rushing to work, gulping coffee, phone wedged between shoulder and ear. She had never really seen her own apartment in this light. And now, she never would again. It was September 3rd, 8:12 a.m., and Sarah had just sold or given away almost everything she owned. In 2 hours, she would lock the door for the last time and walk into a future that was lighter, literally and figuratively, than anything she'd carried in her adult life. But before the door closed, her mind drifted backwards, as it had so many times during the past few months, to the moment the decision first took root. It was February, deep winter, the kind of cold that seems to get under your skin and stay there. Sarah had been sitting in her living room under a blanket, a mug of tea cooling on the coffee table, staring at her laptop. Not working, not even doom-scrolling, just staring. On the screen, a video paused at the exact frame of a smiling couple standing on a cliffside somewhere impossibly green. They wore backpacks, wind in their hair, a sunset at their backs. The title read, "How We Sold Everything to Travel Full-Time." Sarah had clicked it on a whim. But by the end of the first 3 minutes, she was leaning forward, elbows on knees, something stirring that she hadn't felt in years. They spoke about selling their house, giving away 90% of their belongings, keeping only what fit into 2 carry-on backpacks. About working remotely from cafes in Lisbon, rooftops in Istanbul, quiet corners of Kyoto. About trading their mortgage for a life measured in sunsets and conversations, not in bills and commutes. She didn't envy them. That was the strange part. It wasn't envy. It was recognition. A shock of familiarity, as though someone had put words to a truth she'd been carrying without realizing it. That night, Sarah pulled a dusty box from the back of her closet, a box she hadn't opened since moving into the apartment. Inside were photographs from her 20s, travel journals with pages filled in tight, slanted handwriting, boarding passes from trips to places she'd almost forgotten she had visited. There was one journal entry from 2005, written in a hostel bed in Thailand. "If I could live like this forever, I would. I don't need much, just a backpack, a notebook, and enough money for noodles and a roof." She remembered writing it. She also remembered dismissing it as a fantasy when she returned home to the steady hum of office life, the slow accumulation of furniture and bills, the inevitable, one day, that never seemed to arrive. Until that winter night. The decision didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a whisper, a what if she entertained quietly while rinsing dishes or standing in line at the grocery store. What if she didn't have a lease? What if she didn't own a couch, or a desk, or the 100 small items filling her kitchen drawers? She started noticing the weight of her possessions, not in pounds, but in psychic gravity. The bookshelf she dusted but rarely read from. The guest bed that had been slept in exactly twice. The stack of mismatched mugs she'd accumulated from conferences, gift shops, and just because purchases. And then came the real trigger. A letter from her landlord. Rent would be going up, again. She stared at the new number. She could afford it, technically. But the question hit her before she could push it away. If I'm spending this much just to keep my things in place, What am I really working for? That night, she pulled out a legal pad and wrote at the top, what I need versus what I own. Under need, she wrote, laptop, phone, backpack, clothes for all seasons, journal and pens, camera. Under own, she filled 3 columns before her hand cramped. It was the first time she saw it clearly. The months that followed were a blur of Craigslist posts, donation drop-offs, awkward, are you sure you want to get rid of this? Conversations with friends, and evenings spent on the floor surrounded by piles. Keep, sell, donate trash. The first few items were the hardest. The navy blue armchair, where she'd read every Sunday morning. The ceramic vase her mother had given her when she bought the apartment. Each had a story, a little hook that tugged at her resolve. But something shifted after the first dozen things left. The room started to breathe differently. She started to breathe differently. The hardest moment came in July, when she sold her car. It had been with her through 3 moves, 5 jobs, and more road trips than she could count. She took one last drive along the coast before handing over the keys, the salt wind tangling her hair, the radio playing an old song she used to sing in her 20s. When she returned home, she sat on the floor, knees pulled up to her chest, feeling both gutted and strangely free. By the time September came, the apartment looked nothing like the one she had lived in for 10 years. The couch was gone. The bookshelves were empty. The kitchen cupboards held only a skillet, a saucepan, and 2 mugs, one for coffee, one for tea. Her entire life now fit into 2 backpacks, one for clothes and essentials, the other for work gear, laptop, charger, camera, notebook. And so, on that bright September morning, she placed the keys on the table, zipped her backpack, and slung it over her shoulders. She didn't look back when she closed the door. But freedom, she was learning, didn't just come from the absence of possessions. It came from the absence of fear. Fear of what if I need this later? Fear of what will people think? Fear of what if it doesn't work out? She stepped into the sunlight, the city noise rising around her. She felt it in her chest. The space where fear had been was now filled with something else. Not certainty, not even excitement, possibility. And that was enough to take the first step. The air outside felt different. Not because it was particularly fresh. The street still carried the faint scent of car exhaust and the warm, metallic tang of a city morning, but because there was no return point anymore. Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairs, her backpack straps cutting slightly into her shoulders. For 10 years, she had stepped out of this building with a destination fixed in her mind. The office, the grocery store, a friend's apartment, the train station. And always, in the back of her mind, the quiet knowledge that she would come back to the same front door. Not today. Today there was no back. The thought made her chest feel both wide, open, and strangely untethered. She glanced at her phone. 8:46 a.m. The cafe where she planned to meet James wouldn't open for another 15 minutes. James had been one of her first calls when she decided to go through with the downsizing. A friend from her early freelance days. He had been working remotely for years, splitting his time between client projects and photography assignments abroad. When she told him she was letting go of her apartment and most of her things, there had been no long pause. No. Are you sure? Instead, he just said, finally. She started walking toward the cafe, her steps slowing when she passed a second-hand bookstore she'd visited often over the years. Its dusty window displayed a row of old hardcovers, some with their spines cracked, others still holding the stubborn stiffness of a book rarely opened. For a moment, the old pull returned. She could step inside, pick up one of those novels, and bring it with her for the journey ahead. But she didn't. She had her Kindle now, and her rule: if it doesn't fit in the bag, it doesn't come along. Still, she paused to take in the sight. Some pieces of her old life, she decided, didn't need to be owned to be appreciated. When she reached the cafe, James was already outside, leaning against the railing with a paper cup in one hand and his camera slung over his shoulder. His smile was wide and unfiltered, the kind that comes from seeing someone take a leap you've been quietly hoping they'd make. "Backpack looks good on you," he said as she approached. She laughed, adjusting the straps. "Feels heavier than it should." "That's just the beginning," he replied, pushing the door open for her. "Once you're 3 weeks in, you'll start asking yourself why you packed anything." They found a small table near the window, the the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread drifting between them. James pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photos. Markets in Morocco, narrow alleyways in Lisbon, sunrise over rice terraces in Bali. These are all places you could be in a month, he said. But first, you've got to get used to not having a base. It's a bigger adjustment than people think. Sarah sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her. That's the part I'm nervous about. Not the travel. I've traveled plenty. But not having somewhere that's mine. James leaned back in his chair. You'll find that your definition of mine changes. Right now, it's a set of keys. In 6 months, it might be the corner table at a cafe in Mexico City, or the window seat in a library in Prague. She smiled at the thought, but a flicker of doubt passed through her. Could she really live without a permanent anchor? They talked for an hour, mapping out a loose plan. James encouraged her to start small, a month in a nearby city with good internet and affordable short-term rentals. No need to rush into the big international moves just yet. Think of it like breaking in a pair of shoes, he said. You start with short walks before you try the all-day hike. By the time they parted ways, Sarah's notebook held a list of possible first stops. Asheville, North Carolina. Portland, Maine. Santa Fe, New Mexico. Places with character, with walkable streets, with enough novelty to feel like a step out of the old rhythm. The rest of the day was a blur of logistics. Canceling the last of her utilities. Confirming her storage unit. A small, inexpensive space for the handful of things she couldn't part with yet. A box of photos, a folder of important documents, her grandmother's quilt. She spent an hour at the bank, closing one account and opening another with lower international transaction fees. The banker, a young woman with a neat bun and sharp eyeliner, asked about the changes, and Sarah explained, in a condensed version, that she was leaving to travel. That sounds amazing, the woman said. I wish I could do that. Sarah almost gave her the polite, non-committal smile people often use in those moments. The one that says maybe someday you will. But instead, she said, you probably could. It's just a question of how much you're willing to let go of. The woman blinked, pen hovering over the form. I guess I never thought about it that way. By late afternoon, Sarah was sitting in the corner of a small park, backpack beside her, watching the shadows lengthen across the grass. Children chased each other near the fountain, their laughter carrying in the crisp air. An older couple strolled past, hands clasped loosely, their conversation soft but steady. She wondered what they would think if they knew she no longer had an address. That tonight, she'd be staying in a short-term rental across town for a week before heading to her first base city. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister, Claire. Claire, are you really doing this? No home, no car, just floating? Sarah smiled, thumbs moving across the screen. Sarah, not floating, traveling, exploring, choosing. There was a long pause before Claire replied. Claire, I guess I just don't get it. Sarah typed, deleted, and typed again before settling on. Sarah, that's okay. You don't have to. I just know it's right for me. The sun dipped lower, the park growing quieter. She pulled out her journal, flipping to a fresh page. Day 1. The part that scares me most isn't leaving. It's the possibility that I'll love it so much I'll never want to come back. She underlined it twice, then closed the notebook. That night, in her temporary rental, she unpacked just enough to get through the week. She placed her journal on the nightstand, her camera on the desk, and her laptop on the small round table by the window. The rest stayed in the backpack. She sat on the bed, the city lights blinking through the blinds, and thought about the weeks ahead. The uncertainty didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a blank page. The bus rumbled to a stop with a low hiss of brakes. Sarah pressed her palm to the cool glass and took in her new surroundings. Asheville, North Carolina. She'd chosen it for reasons that made perfect sense on paper. A small but vibrant city, walkable downtown, known for its creative community, with trails and mountains close enough to escape the hum of traffic in under 20 minutes. The kind of place where she could test this new life without the culture shock of being halfway across the world. But now, standing on the sidewalk with her backpack straps tugging on her shoulders, she realized this wasn't a trial run. This was it. The first real stop in a life she had designed to be in constant motion. The September air here felt different, cleaner somehow, as though it carried less of the invisible heaviness she'd grown used to in the city she'd left behind. The sun was just beginning to drop toward the horizon. The lights stretched in long amber streaks across the buildings. Somewhere nearby, a busker's guitar threaded through the evening air. The short-term rental she'd booked was a second-floor studio above a bakery. When she opened the door, the warm smell of bread and sugar drifted up from the ovens below. The apartment was small, maybe 300 square feet, but bright, with a single large window that framed a slice of sky and a rooftop garden across the street. She set her backpack down in the middle of the room. For a moment, she just stood there, taking in the silence. In her old apartment, arriving home had always meant sorting mail, hanging up her coat, kicking off shoes in the same corner. Here, there was none of that muscle memory, just space and the quiet hum of a mini fridge. Sarah unpacked slowly, clothes into the narrow closet, laptop on the desk, journal and pen on the nightstand. Everything else stayed in the bag. She had decided early on not to nest too much in temporary spaces. The less she spread out, the easier it would be to leave again. That first evening, she wandered the streets without a plan. She passed art galleries with their doors propped open, the scent of oil paint and wood mingling in the air. Breweries with chalkboard menus listing seasonal Alish. Bookstores tucked between cafes. There was a hum to the place, quieter than a city, but alive. When she ducked into a small bar for dinner, the bartender slid over a menu and asked where she was visiting from. Everywhere, she said without thinking. He laughed. That's a good answer. The next morning, she began what she called her base city ritual. Step 1. Find a local cafe she could work from regularly. She picked one with mismatched chairs, strong coffee, and Wi-Fi that didn't cut out every time someone microwaved something in the back. Step 2. Map the essentials: grocery store, laundromat, bus routes, a nearby trail. Step 3. Meet at least one local within the first week. That last part wasn't about networking. It was about grounding herself in each place, finding a human connection to go with the streets and skylines. By the fourth day, she had a rhythm. Mornings in the cafe with her laptop, answering emails, and finishing up freelance work. Afternoons exploring, hiking a nearby trail, wandering the River Arts District, or sitting in a park with her journal. Evenings split between cooking simple meals in the studio and treating herself to dinners at small, family-run restaurants she found through conversations with locals. It was in one of those restaurants, a dimly lit Thai place on the edge of downtown, that she met Eliza. Eliza was in her late 50s, with a warm smile and silver hair cut in a short bob. She owned the place with her brother and had moved to Asheville years ago for a break that turned into forever. They got to talking when Sarah asked about the framed photographs on the wall. Eliza explained that each one was taken by a local photographer they showcased every month. By the end of dinner, Eliza had invited her to a community art night happening that Friday. The art night was held in a repurposed warehouse. Strings of lights hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the scent of clay, paint, and coffee. Local musicians played in one corner, their music blending with the soft hum of conversation. Sarah wandered between tables of handmade jewelry, hand-bound journals, and watercolor landscapes. At one booth, she struck up a conversation with a man selling hand-carved wooden spoons. He talked about the grain of the wood like it was a living thing, each pattern telling its own story. And for the first time since leaving her apartment, Sarah felt a spark of belonging. Not because she wanted to settle here, but because she realized that belonging didn't have to be tied to permanence. It could be found in moments, in conversations, in the shared appreciation of something crafted by hand. Of course, not everything was effortless. By the second week, she was already bumping into the realities of life without an address. Packages had to be sent to a local pickup point, and one was delayed for days. Cooking was a challenge with only 2 burners and a single pan. And the studio's walls were thin enough that she could hear her downstairs neighbor's alarm clock every morning at 6:15. But the inconveniences didn't carry the same weight they once might have. She'd learned to work around them, to see them as part of the deal she'd made when she traded stability for mobility. One afternoon, while hiking the Blue Ridge Parkway, she stopped at an overlook where the mountains rolled into the distance like waves. She sat on the stone wall, the wind tugging at her hair, and thought about how different this view was from the one she'd had in her apartment. Back then, she'd been surrounded by buildings, her world framed by glass and concrete. Now, There was no frame at all, just horizon. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "The less I own, the more I seem to see." The end of her month in Asheville came faster than she expected. On her last day, she returned to the cafe where she'd spent most mornings. The barista, who had started greeting her by name halfway through the month, handed her a coffee and asked where she was heading next. "Not sure yet," Sarah said, and she meant it. That was part of the freedom she'd been chasing, the ability to decide on a whim, to follow curiosity instead of a lease agreement. She spent the afternoon walking the streets one last time, passing the bookstore, the art galleries, the bakery downstairs from her studio. She felt a flicker of sadness, but it was lighter than the grief she'd once felt leaving a home. Because now, leaving didn't mean losing. It meant making room for the next chapter. The airport was a strange mix of calm and chaos. Calm in the slow, rhythmic roll of her carry-on wheels over the tile floor. Chaos in the bright, flickering departures board with its dizzying list of cities and times. Sarah stood in line at the gate, passport in hand, the boarding announcement for Lisbon echoing overhead. This was it, her first step across the Atlantic since she'd sold her apartment. The first time she'd be living abroad without the crutch of knowing a fixed home was waiting behind her. She could still remember the way Asheville had smelled in the early morning on the day she left. Coffee roasting, wet leaves from an overnight rain, the faint sugar of the bakery downstairs. She'd left her little studio with the same backpack she'd arrived with. No extra souvenirs, no extra baggage. Her entire life was still just 2 bags, a carry-on for clothes and a compact backpack for her work gear and essentials. She liked it that way, the smallness of it, the simplicity. It made the vastness of the departure board feel less overwhelming. On the plane, she found herself in a window seat next to an older woman with kind eyes and a knitted cardigan. They exchanged small talk during takeoff, where they were from, where they were going, why. When Sarah explained she'd sold almost everything she owned to travel full-time, the woman tilted her head. "That's brave," she said. "Or crazy." Sarah smiled. "Maybe both." The woman chuckled. "Well, brave and crazy often share a border." Hours later, Lisbon appeared below them, a patchwork of red rooftops spilling toward the sea, sunlight glinting off the water. The sight caught Sarah in the chest. It wasn't just beautiful. It was different. Different in a way that made her remember why she'd left. Disembarking, she felt the shift immediately. The unfamiliar hum of Portuguese in her ears, the warm Atlantic air on her face, the slower, looser pace of people walking through the terminal. She followed the signs to the metro, the weight of her bags familiar now, almost comforting. She had no permanent address, but she knew how to carry her life. Her rental in Lisbon was a small studio in the Alfama district, tucked into a narrow cobblestone street that curved like a question mark. The building was old, with whitewashed walls and blue-tiled facades that told stories in their patterns. The stairs were steep, each one worn down by centuries of feet. By the time she reached the 3rd floor, she was out of breath, but when she opened the door, she stopped. The room was simple: a bed, a small table, a kitchenette, a single window. But that window framed the kind of view she had only ever seen in travel books. A cascade of tiled rooftops, laundry lines strung between buildings, and beyond them, a slice of deep blue ocean. She dropped her bags and walked straight to the window, resting her palms on the sill. For a moment, she just breathed. The first few days were a blur of discovery. She wandered the tangled streets, getting lost, and finding her way again by instinct. She learned where to get the best pastel de nata, where the light hit the buildings just right in the late afternoon, where the old men gathered to play cards in the park. She set up her work routine at a cafe that overlooked the river, the barista quickly learning her name and order. The rhythm was familiar: morning work, afternoon exploration, but everything else felt new. And that was both exhilarating and exhausting. The exhaustion hit hardest on day 6, when she woke to find her phone's SIM card malfunctioning. No internet meant no maps, no translation app, no easy way to check in with clients. In her old life, she might have panicked. Here, she surprised herself. She pulled out a paper map she'd picked up at the airport, circled the location of a phone shop, and navigated there by memory and the occasional street sign. It took hours and 3 different shops to get it sorted. But by the end of the day, she realized something. She was starting to trust herself in the unknown. On her second weekend in Lisbon, she took a day trip to Sintra. The train wound its way through rolling hills and past pale yellow houses with terracotta roofs. At the top of one steep climb, the Peña Palace appeared, all bright colors and whimsical turrets, like something from a storybook. She wandered its gardens, stopping at a quiet overlook where the Atlantic stretched endlessly to the west. She thought about the miles she'd traveled to get here, the things she'd left behind, not just furniture and clothes, but routines, assumptions, old fears. One evening, sitting at her apartment window as the sun turned the rooftops gold, Sarah pulled out her journal. She wrote about the way travel made her aware of time differently. How days here felt longer, not because of clocks, but because she noticed more of them. She wrote about the freedom of waking up without the weight of possessions around her, about the challenge of balancing work and exploration, about the unexpected joy of learning to order coffee in Portuguese without glancing at her phone. She ended the entry with a single line: "The less I own, the more I belong anywhere." Her month in Lisbon flew by. By the final week, she had a small circle of familiar faces: the barista at her cafe, the neighbor who always nodded as they passed on the stairs, the fruit vendor who insisted she try a fig before buying a bag. When it came time to pack, the process took less than 30 minutes. Everything she needed fit exactly where it had when she arrived. That, she realized, was part of the magic. Every place could be home, but no place could own her. It happened in Barcelona. 2 weeks after she'd left Lisbon, Sarah arrived in Spain with the lightness of someone convinced she was finally in the rhythm of her new life. She'd booked a small apartment in the Elborn district, narrow streets that twisted and turned like a maze, balconies dripping with flowers, the air carrying the scent of fresh bread and the faint salt of the sea. The first few days were almost intoxicating. She worked mornings at a cafe near the Santa Maria del Mar church, its stone walls echoing with centuries of footsteps. Afternoons were spent walking down to the harbor, through the Gothic Quarter, or up to Parc de la Ciutadella, where she'd sit with her journal and watch children sail toy boats in the fountain. It was a city made for wandering, for losing track of hours, and she let herself sink into it. The trouble began on a Tuesday. She woke to the sound of heavy rain against the windows. Not the light, pleasant kind that cooled the air, but the hard, relentless drumming of a storm that had settled in with no intention of leaving. The sky outside was a uniform gray, the kind that made midday feel like evening. Her first thought was that she'd work from her apartment that day. She made coffee, opened her laptop, and nothing. No connection. The Wi-Fi router blinked an angry red light. She reset it, waited. Nothing. By the time she reached her landlord, the answer was short and apologetic. The building's connection was down due to the storm. Repairs were underway, but it could be a day or two. For someone working remotely with deadlines, a day or two wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Sarah grabbed her backpack, stuffed in her laptop, and set out into the rain. Her first stop was the cafe she'd been frequenting, closed. The storm had knocked out power in several blocks. She tried another cafe, then another. One was full. Another had no available outlets. By the time she found a place with both power and Wi-Fi, she was soaked through. She ordered a coffee, pulled out her laptop, and opened her project files, only to realize she'd left her external hard drive back at the apartment. The files she needed weren't in the cloud. She'd been meaning to back them up, but kept putting it off. Her stomach sank. She made the trip back through the rain, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, hair plastered to her forehead. When she finally returned to the cafe with the hard drive, it was late afternoon. She worked for hours, fingers flying across the keyboard, pausing only to sip lukewarm coffee. By the time she sent the final file, her eyes burned from staring at the screen. The rain had eased into a drizzle outside, the streets slick and reflecting the soft glow of street lamps. She felt wrung out, not just from the work, but from the reminder that this life, the one she'd chosen so freely, came with no built-in safety net. If she didn't find solutions fast, there was no home office to retreat to, no spare equipment in a closet, no familiar infrastructure to lean on. The next day brought a new challenge. Her bank app wouldn't load. She tried different devices, different browsers. Nothing. A quick search confirmed the problem. Her bank had flagged unusual activity after she'd used her card in Spain. The automated email said to call a number to verify transactions. She called. The wait time was 45 minutes. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to hold music that sounded like it had been composed in the 1980s, watching the minutes tick by on her phone screen. When the call finally connected, the voice on the other end was polite but firm. Yes, they could restore access, but it might take until the next business day, which meant she had to get through the next 24 hours on the cash she had left in her wallet, 32 euros. That night, she sat at the small table by her window and took a deep breath. This was the test, she realized. Not the romantic version of travel she'd been living since Lisbon. This was the reality check, the part of the story where she'd either adapt or admit she wasn't ready for the unpredictability. She opened her journal and wrote 2 columns. Things I can control and things I can't. Under can control, she wrote. Back up work files to the cloud daily. Keep emergency cash hidden in bag. Research local co-working spaces before arriving in new city. Notify bank before travel to avoid freezes. Under can't, she wrote. Storms. Building-wide Wi-Fi outages. Bank processing times. The fact that not every day will feel easy. She underlined the last point twice. The rain cleared the next morning. She took a walk along the waterfront, the air fresh with the smell of salt and wet stone. She found a co-working space near the marina, bright, with long communal tables and fast internet. She signed up for a week. It felt like a small victory, not just because she'd solved a logistical problem, but because she'd caught herself before slipping into panic. She'd found a way to keep moving forward. The following days were smoother. She worked mornings at the co-working space, then explored the city in the afternoons. She visited the Sagrada Familia, its spires rising like something out of a dream. She sat in the shadow of the Arc de Triomphe, sketching its red brick arches in her notebook. She even took a cooking class, learning to make paella alongside travelers from half a dozen countries. But the storm had left something behind, not just in the streets, but in her awareness. A reminder that this life wasn't about escaping problems. It was about meeting them head-on, in unfamiliar places, with only what she could carry on her back. And she realized she liked that challenge. It made her sharper, more deliberate. It forced her to plan without over-planning, to be resourceful without clinging to control. On her last evening in Barcelona, she returned to the same cafe where she'd spent that long, rainy Tuesday. The barista recognized her, smiled, and said, "Back again?" "Yeah," she replied, smiling back. Back and moving on. It was in Prague when it hit her. Not the mild, fleeting, kind of missing something that comes when you smell a food you grew up with or hear a song from high school. This was the kind of homesickness that settled into her chest like a stone. She had arrived in the city during the crisp, pale light of late autumn. The streets were lined with bare-branched trees, their leaves piled in damp corners. Every building seemed to hold centuries in its walls, the kind of beauty that made you slow down without realizing it. Her flat was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building with a red door and a view of a small courtyard. The first week was a dream. She walked across Charles Bridge at sunrise, wandered Old Town Square at night when the crowds had thinned, sipped hot mulled wine under strings of lights. But the second week brought rain. Long, gray stretches of it. The kind that kept you indoors not because it was impossible to go out, but because it made the thought of going out feel heavier. One Tuesday evening, Sarah sat at the small wooden table in her kitchen with her laptop open, a mug of tea cooling beside her. She just finished a video call with a client and had meant to start drafting an article. But instead, she stared at the cursor blinking on an empty page. She reached for her phone out of habit, scrolling through photos her sister had posted, a family dinner she'd missed, her nieces laughing in matching sweaters. She lingered on a short video of them, singing off-key to a birthday cake. The ache that rose in her chest surprised her. She'd always been independent, always comfortable with long stretches of time away from family and friends. But now, thousands of miles away, in a city where no one knew her name beyond the barista at the cafe down the street, it felt different. She closed the laptop and walked to the window. The courtyard below was dark, the only sound the distant rush of rain in the gutters. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, hair pulled into a loose bun, sweater sleeves pulled over her hands. For the first time since she'd left her apartment months ago, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Not because she didn't love the life she'd been building. She did. But because she hadn't factored in this. The way distance could stretch, not just in miles, but in moments. How birthdays and dinners and casual Saturday mornings with friends weren't things you could just catch up on later. The next morning, she woke with the same heaviness. She went through her routine: coffee, a few hours of work, lunch at a cafe, but it all felt muted. She didn't feel like exploring that day. Instead, she returned to the flat and dug through the front pocket of her backpack until she found her travel journal. She opened it to the very first entry from the morning she'd left her old apartment. The space where fear used to be is now filled with possibility. She stared at the words. They were still true, but they weren't the whole truth anymore. That evening, she decided to walk anyway. She crossed the Vltava River, the cobblestones slick beneath her boots, the city lights shimmering in the wet streets. She followed the sound of music until she found herself in a small wine bar tucked into the corner of a narrow lane. Inside, the air was warm, smelling faintly of oak and cloves. A trio was playing jazz in the corner, their music threading through the soft hum of conversation. She ordered a glass of red and took a seat at the bar. The bartender, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a slow smile, asked where she was from. When she explained her nomadic life, he nodded knowingly. "I traveled like that once," he said. "It's beautiful, but sometimes lonely." She felt something loosen in her chest at the honesty. "Yeah," she admitted. "Sometimes." They talked for an hour, about the city, about the places he'd seen, about the people you meet when you're always in motion. Before she left, he poured her a small glass of something clear and strong. "Becherovka," he said, "for homesickness. It won't fix it, but it will make tonight warmer." She smiled, thanked him, and stepped back into the rain. Back in her flat, she sat at the table and opened her journal again. This time, she wrote without editing herself. "Tonight I realized something. Home isn't one place, but it also isn't everywhere. It's in the people who know you. It's in the faces that don't need explanations. And sometimes, it's in a wine bar where a stranger listens without rushing you. Maybe I can carry pieces of home with me, just not all at once." She underlined that last sentence twice. The next day, she made a list of ways to stay connected. Weekly calls with her sister, a shared photo album with friends, postcards to her nieces, even if they arrived weeks late. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something, and she realized that in this life, something often had to be enough. By the time her month in Prague was ending, the heaviness had lifted. Not completely. She knew it would return in waves. But she also knew she could meet it when it came. As she packed her bag, she tucked 3 postcards into the side pocket, addressed but unsent. She dropped them in a mailbox before heading to the train station. It was a small ritual, but it felt like a thread, a way of stitching herself to the people she loved, no matter where she was. The air in Marrakesh didn't just touch your skin. It wrapped around you, warm and fragrant, pressing the city's pulse into your senses before you could name it. Sarah felt at the moment she stepped through the Riad's heavy wooden door and into the sunlit courtyard. Above her, the square of open sky glowed an impossible blue, framed by walls of hand-painted tile in deep cobalt and burnt orange. The sound of trickling water from the central fountain blended with the faint clink of glass from somewhere upstairs. She could smell mint tea steeping, sweet, sharp, and fresh, a smell that would come to anchor her memory of Morocco long after she left. This was her second day in the city. Her first had been a whirlwind. The flight from Lisbon, the long taxi ride from the airport that had felt like threading through a maze of horns and sudden turns, the jolt of stepping into the Medina, where streets were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The Medina wasn't a place that eased you in. It demanded attention. Motorbikes zipped past at alarming proximity. Vendors called out from stalls stacked with woven baskets, pyramids of spices, leather bags. Somewhere a man was pounding copper into shape with rhythmic strikes. A boy darted through the crowd with a tray of tea glasses balanced effortlessly in one hand. It was chaos, but it was alive. On the rooftop terrace that morning, Sarah had been savoring her coffee when she noticed a young woman at the next table. She had that unmistakable posture of someone both hyper-aware and withdrawn, hunched over her phone, jaw set, fingers moving quickly across the screen. Sarah knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror her first week in Barcelona, on that storm-soaked Tuesday when nothing seemed to go right. The woman, maybe mid-20s, had olive-toned skin, dark eyes, and thick black hair braided over one shoulder. A scuffed, overstuffed backpack leaned against her chair. The zipper strain told Sarah she'd packed for just in case rather than travel light. Sarah hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but there was something about the tension in the woman's shoulders that pulled her forward. "First week here?" Sarah asked with a small, careful smile. The woman looked up, startled. "First day." Her voice carried the faint rasp of someone who hadn't spoken much since arriving. Sarah nodded knowingly. "That explains it. You've got the overwhelmed but determined face." The woman blinked, then let out a short laugh. It cracked the guardedness in her expression. Her name was Lena. She was from Toronto, she explained, and had been planning this trip for almost 2 years. She'd left her corporate job at a marketing firm 3 weeks ago, telling herself she'd finally see the world. But Marrakesh wasn't playing the role she'd scripted. That morning alone, she'd gotten lost twice, accidentally agreed to pay a taxi driver double because she didn't have exact change, and bought a SIM card that didn't work. Sarah listened, nodding, her mind turning over familiar parallels. The misconnections, the wrong turns, the gnawing sense that you'd made a mistake before you'd even unpacked. "I can give you the name of a shop that'll fix that SIM," Sarah said, "and a trick for the taxis. But the getting lost part," she smiled, "that's unavoidable." That afternoon, they decided to explore together. Sarah had no urgent work deadlines, and sensed Lena could use a win. The Medina wrapped around them like a labyrinth, narrow passageways where the scent of cumin and saffron lingered in the air, where sunlight fell in broken shards through latticework above. At one corner, a man sat cross-legged surrounded by small metal teapots that gleamed like captured starlight. At another, a stall overflowed with pomegranates split open to reveal jewel-like seeds. Sarah noticed how Lena stuck close at first, her gaze darting to every unexpected sound. But as the hours passed, something shifted. She began to slow her pace, linger over stalls, ask questions. At a spice shop, she let the vendor pour her a small cone of Ras El Han out in her palm, so she could breathe in the complexity. At a rug shop, she tried haggling for the first time, laughing when she got a price drop just by hesitating at the doorway. By late afternoon, they emerged into Jima Elfna Square. The energy there was like nothing Sarah had ever seen. Food stalls smoking with grilled lamb and skewered vegetables, snake charmers coaxing slow sways from cobras, acrobats forming human towers. Lena's eyes widened. "It's chaos, but beautiful chaos." Sarah grinned. "Exactly." Over the next few days, their paths kept crossing. Once in the Medina, where Sarah was buying fresh figs, and once in a quiet cafe tucked behind an unmarked wooden door. With each meeting, Lena's questions dug deeper. How do you deal with not having a home? Don't you miss people? How do you make sure the money lasts? Sarah answered as honestly as she could. Yes, she missed people. Yes, sometimes it was lonely. But she had learned ways to tether herself, rituals that traveled with her, like morning journaling and finding one cafe to return to repeatedly until it felt like her spot. She talked about budgeting, tracking every expense, staying in cities where the cost of living matched her freelance income, always keeping an emergency fund. She mentioned mistakes she'd made, the times she'd booked last-minute flights and paid double, the months she'd underestimated living costs and had to take on extra work. "You sound steady," Lena said one evening over mint tea. Sarah laughed softly. "That's just because I've been through the messy part already." One afternoon, Sarah invited Lena to join her for a small detour, a visit to the tanneries on the edge of the Medina. It was not a tourist-sanitized stop. The smell alone was enough to make most visitors turn back. Sharp, pungent, almost overwhelming. Workers stood knee-deep in large stone vats, dipping hides in natural dyes that bloomed in shades of crimson, gold, and indigo. Lena wrinkled her nose at first, but then began snapping photos, fascinated by the rawness of it. "It's not pretty," she said, "but it's real." Sarah nodded. Travel isn't always postcard perfect. Sometimes it's this. And if you only chase the perfect, you miss the truth. Their last evening together, they met again on the rooftop terrace. The call to prayer rose over the city, folding itself into the fading light. The rooftops glowed in warm orange, and the air cooled just enough for a light breeze. "I was so close to booking a flight home that first day," Lena admitted. If you hadn't talked to me, I probably would have. Sarah shook her head. You would have found your way. Maybe it just would have taken longer. But how did you know I'd be okay? Sarah thought for a moment, her fingers wrapped around the warm glass of mint tea. Because I saw myself in you. And I'm okay. The next morning, Sarah watched from the doorway of the riad as Lena walked away, her backpack still heavy, but her stride lighter. Sarah returned to the rooftop alone, the city still waking up beneath her. She realized that for the first time since starting her travels, she'd been more than just a student of the road. She'd been a teacher, even if only for a week. And that, she thought, was another kind of freedom. The bus from Lisbon to the Algarve coast traced the edge of the country like a slow exhale. To Sarah, it felt different from every journey she'd taken since leaving Asheville. Not just because of the scenery, the rolling hills covered in almond trees, the occasional flash of the Atlantic through breaks in the cliffs, but because this wasn't just another stop. This was going to be home for 3 months. For the first time in her nomadic life, she had decided to stay still for longer than a month. She wanted to see what happened when the road wasn't always tugging her forward, when she had the same front door to walk through day after day. Part of her was curious. Part of her was afraid of what that stillness might reveal. Her apartment was on the edge of a fishing village that had been slowly absorbing travelers and artists for years. The building itself was pale yellow, with peeling shutters and a balcony that faced the sea. When she opened the balcony doors for the first time, the salt wind rushed in, carrying the cries of gulls and the rhythmic hush of waves. Inside, the space was simple: whitewashed walls, terracotta tile floors, a small wooden table, and a kitchen that could fit 2 people if they didn't mind standing close. In the corner of the living room sat a wicker chair with a faded cushion that looked like it had been left out in the sun for decades. She put her bag down, walked to the balcony, and leaned on the railing. Below, fishermen were mending nets, their hands moving in slow, practiced motions. Beyond them, the ocean stretched to the horizon, a shifting palette of blues and greens. She felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected, the sense of being tethered, even if just by the salt air and the promise of tomorrow looking much like today. The first week was all novelty. She explored the narrow cobblestone streets, memorizing which alleys led to the bakery that sold bread still warm from the oven, which to the small market with fresh sardines and tomatoes sweet enough to eat like fruit. She found a cafe with mismatched chairs and a single table always bathed in morning sun. The owner, a wiry man named Rue, served espresso without asking for her order after the second day. She began to recognize faces: the woman who sold flowers outside the church, the boy who rode his bike in wide, looping circles through the plaza, the old man who sat on the same bench every afternoon, smoking and watching the sea. For the first time since she'd started traveling, she wasn't rushing to see everything. She was letting the place seep in her slowly, the way tidewater soaks into sand. But stillness had its own weight. By the second month, she began to notice the edges of her restlessness. She'd wake in the morning and feel the pull to check flight prices, to imagine herself in a new city. The novelty had faded, replaced by the quiet repetition of days. Some evenings, sitting alone on her balcony, she'd wonder if she was betraying the very thing she'd left her old life to find: constant movement, the thrill of arriving somewhere unknown. Other nights, she found herself unexpectedly grateful for the predictability, the comfort of knowing where the best tomatoes were, the way Rue would wave when she passed the cafe, even if she wasn't stopping in. It was a strange balance, like standing with one foot on the dock and one in a boat, unsure which way to lean. Halfway through her stay, she decided to take a small step toward deeper connection. She signed up for a Portuguese language class at the community center. The class met twice a week in a sunny room with chalkboards older than most of the students. They were a mixed group: retirees from Britain, a German couple who had moved to the coast permanently, and a few locals brushing up on grammar. For Sarah, the lessons were humbling. Portuguese was harder than she'd expected, the pronunciation trickier, the grammar full of twists. But something happened when she tried to order her coffee in Rue's cafe using the new word she'd learned. He smiled, corrected her gently, and slipped a pastel de nata onto her plate without charge. The exchange was small, but it made the town feel less like a backdrop and more like a place she was in. By the third month, her life had a rhythm. Mornings started with a walk along the cliffs, the ocean throwing spray against the rocks. Afternoons were for work at her kitchen table or the cafe. Evenings often meant cooking something simple, grilled fish, fresh bread, salad, and eating on the balcony as the sun turned the water to molten gold. She began keeping a different kind of journal entry here. Not just notes on where she'd been or what she'd seen, but reflections on what she'd felt. She wrote about the tension between motion and rest, about the way routine could be both a comfort and a cage. She asked herself hard questions. Was freedom just about moving, or could it be about choosing where to stop? Near the end of her stay, she met Anna, a local artist who ran a small gallery by the harbor. They struck up a conversation over a painting of the sea, Anna explaining the way the light shifted with the seasons, Sarah listening and realizing she'd never thought about the ocean as having its own moods. Anna invited her to a small gathering at her home one Friday night. It was the first time Sarah had been in someone's home since arriving. They ate seafood stew around a long table, the conversation flowing between Portuguese and English, the air warm with laughter. That night, walking back along the quiet streets, Sarah realized that staying longer had allowed something travel often didn't: the slow weaving of threads into a fabric. On her last morning, she stood on the balcony with her coffee, watching the fishermen push their boats into the water. The tide was going out, leaving behind wet sand that caught the early light. She felt the same tug she'd felt when she'd arrived, the pull between leaving and staying. When she finally picked up her bag, she knew this. The road would always call her, but now she also knew she could stop and listen without losing herself. Freedom, she thought, wasn't just the ability to move. It was the ability to choose when not to. The first time Sarah stepped out of the airport into Mexico City's high-altitude air, she felt the city before she heard it. It wasn't the kind of overwhelming chaos she'd feared, not an immediate wall of noise, but a layered hum, like the city was speaking in 1,000 voices at once. The rumble of buses, the calls of street vendors, the faint tinny music from a shop radio, the syncopated rhythm of footsteps on pavement. She'd chosen Mexico City deliberately. After her 3 months in the Algarve, she'd realized she wanted her next stop to be the opposite of quiet coastal life, a place where the air buzzed with energy. And she wanted to commit to something she'd only brushed against before, learning a language deeply enough to think in it. Spanish had been hovering at the edges of her travels for years. She knew polite phrases, a handful of useful verbs, and enough to order food or find a bathroom. But this time, she wasn't content to get by. This time, she wanted to belong. Her apartment was in Roma Norte, a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and Art Deco buildings painted in faded pastels. From her balcony, she could see a small park where children played after school, their laughter rising above the clatter of passing bicycles. The street below had everything she could need within a few blocks: a corner shop that sold fresh tortillas, a cafe with tiny marble tables, and a fruit stand where mangoes and papayas spilled from wooden crates in rich colors. Her first morning, she walked to a nearby language school, the air still cool with the remnants of night. Inside, the walls were painted bright yellow, and the sound of Spanish filled every corner. Greetings, jokes, the soft correction of grammar from one student to another. Her teacher, Camila, greeted her with a firm handshake and a smile that reached her eyes. She spoke only in Spanish from the start, her words slow but deliberate, her gestures filling in the gaps. The first week was exhausting in the best way. Sarah's days began with 2 hours of class, where they practiced conversation in small groups, learned verb conjugations that twisted in unexpected ways, and acted out scenarios, buying groceries, asking for directions, making small talk with strangers. Afternoons were for immersion. Camila encouraged her students to spend at least part of each day speaking only Spanish, even if it meant fumbling for words. Sarah took the challenge seriously. At the fruit stand, she asked for mangoes by weight, carefully repeating the numbers back to the vendor until his nod told her she'd gotten it right. At the cafe, she ordered coffee with milk without slipping into English. In the evenings, she watched telenovelas with Spanish subtitles, catching just enough to follow the drama. But learning a language wasn't just about words. It was about rhythm, about the way greetings changed depending on the time of day, about how people layered politeness and warmth into the simplest exchanges. One afternoon, She tried asking for directions to a bookstore. The man she stopped didn't just tell her where to go. He walked her 3 blocks, pointing out landmarks along the way. When they reached the store, he wished her buen dia with a sincerity that made her realize something. Spanish wasn't just a tool for communication. It was a way of showing connection. By the second month, she was dreaming in fragments of Spanish. Not full sentences yet, but flashes of conversation, stray words floating through her sleep. Her confidence grew. She joined a cooking class taught entirely in Spanish, learning to make tamales wrapped in corn husks, listening to the instructor's stories about her grandmother's recipes. She began to understand the humor and jokes told around the table before the translation came. One night, she went to a salsa club with classmates. At first, she hung back, unsure of the steps, but a woman from the school pulled her onto the floor. "Escucha," she said. "Listen." Sarah did. And in that crowded room, surrounded by music and laughter, she felt something shift, the same way she had felt in the Algarve when she realized she could belong somewhere simply by choosing to stay. Not everything was easy. There were days when her brain felt like it had been wrung out. Days when she misunderstood someone and ended up with something she hadn't meant to order. Days when she retreated to her apartment, craving the ease of English. But each stumble came with a lesson. She learned to carry a small notebook, to jot down new words. She learned that mistakes weren't failures, just stepping stones. And she learned that fluency wasn't a single moment you achieved. It was something you built, conversation by conversation. Her breakthrough came during a neighborhood festival. The streets were strung with papal picado in bright colors, food stalls sending the scent of grilled meat and cinnamon into the air. A group of older women were selling handmade crafts, and Sarah stopped to admire the embroidery on a blouse. One of the women struck up a conversation. Sarah replied in Spanish without thinking, the words flowing more smoothly than they ever had. They talked about the patterns in the embroidery, about the hours it took to finish one blouse, about how the designs told stories of the villages they came from. When Sarah finally walked away, blouse in hand, she realized she hadn't translated in her head once. The language had simply been there. By her final week in Mexico City, she felt a bittersweet pull. She knew she couldn't stay forever. The road would call again. But leaving meant stepping away from the web of small connections she'd woven here. The vendor who now set aside the ripest mangoes for her. The cafe owner who teased her about always ordering the same breakfast. The classmates who had become friends over shared mistakes and triumphs. On her last morning, she walked to the park one more time. The trees cast shifting shadows on the path, and the air was filled with the sound of children laughing. She sat on a bench, notebook in hand, and wrote in Spanish for the first time without reaching for a dictionary. The sentences weren't perfect, but they were hers. She closed the notebook, looked out at the park, and thought, this wasn't just a city she'd visited. It was a place she'd learned to speak into, and in return, it had spoken back. Kyoto in winter was quieter than Sarah had imagined. She had pictured bustling streets filled with tourists, temple grounds teeming with visitors, markets spilling over with food stalls. Instead, she stepped off the train into a city wrapped in pale winter light, the air cool and dry, the sky a washed-out blue that made the bare branches of cherry trees look like brushstrokes against paper. The first breath she took felt clean in a way she couldn't quite name. The second held a faint trace of wood smoke, drifting from somewhere unseen. After months in the dense, restless hum of Mexico City, Kyoto's slower pulse hit her like a wave. This was a place where time seemed to stretch differently, not faster or slower, exactly, but with the kind of patience that asked you to match it. Her apartment was a small one-room space in a Machia-style building. Its wood darkened with age. The sliding paper doors let in soft, diffused light, and the tatama mats released a faint grassy scent when she stepped on them. There was no sofa, only a low table with floor cushions, and in the corner, a small heater that clicked softly as it warmed the room. On her first morning, she opened the door to find a dusting of snow on the narrow street outside. The neighbors' bicycles were parked neatly in a row, their seats holding thin white caps. A woman in a long wool coat swept her front step, pausing to bow slightly as Sarah passed. She'd come to Kyoto without much of an agenda, carrying only a vague wish to see the temples, walk through the bamboo grove, maybe take a train to the countryside. But the city's stillness pressed against her own restless instincts. She found herself moving more slowly without trying, taking time to notice the way frost clung to a stone wall, the way steam curled from a bowl of ramen in the cold air. One afternoon, she visited Ryuan-ji, the famous Zen rock garden. The air was crisp, the garden nearly empty. She sat on the wooden veranda, her breath visible in the winter air, and stared at the 15 stones set in raked white gravel. At first, her mind tried to work, to interpret, to assign meaning, to understand why this arrangement had been revered for centuries. But the longer she sat, the more her thoughts softened, losing their edges. She began to notice the silence between the occasional caw of a crow, the shifting patterns in the gravel where the rake had passed, the way her own heartbeat felt louder here. When she finally stood, she felt lighter without knowing why. The days began to take on a rhythm. Mornings often started with a walk to a small cafe, tucked into a side street, where the barista bowed as she entered and set a cup of coffee on the counter without asking for her order. Afternoons were for wandering, to Nishiki Market, where narrow aisles overflowed with dried seafood, pickled vegetables, and skewers of grilled mochi, to temples whose gates stood open to empty courtyards. She learned to carry a small cloth handkerchief, like the locals, to wipe her hands after washing them at temple entrances. She learned to stand quietly in train stations rather than pace, to wait for the exact moment the light changed before crossing. It was as though the city was teaching her a different way to occupy time. But stillness brought its own challenges. After the first few weeks, she began to feel the familiar tug of restlessness. The slower pace, which had seemed calming at first, now felt almost too quiet. She missed the easy social connection she'd found in Mexico City, the spontaneous conversations at markets, the laughter spilling from late-night gatherings. Kyoto didn't offer that easily, not in winter, and not to a newcomer. Most interactions stayed polite, contained, wrapped in a layer of formality. One evening, feeling particularly isolated, she wandered into a tiny izakaya near her apartment. The place had only 5 stools, all occupied by locals. She hesitated at the door, ready to retreat, when the owner, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, waved her in and pulled a stool from the corner. She ordered sake and a small plate of grilled fish, and though her Japanese was halting, the owner asked where she was from. A man seated 2 stools away joined the conversation, offering recommendations for places to see in the city. By the time she left, the isolation had loosened its grip just a little. She began to make small adjustments. She signed up for a tea ceremony class, where she learned to fold a cloth just so, to turn the bowl before drinking, to notice the quiet dignity in each motion. She visited a pottery workshop and spent an afternoon shaping clay into a small bowl, her fingers stiff from the cold but steady. These weren't the adrenaline jolts of travel she'd known before. They were slower satisfactions, built from repetition and attention. Midway through her stay, the snow came heavier. She woke one morning to find the street transformed, the world hushed under a thick white blanket. Even the bicycles had disappeared under the drifts. She bundled herself in layers, pulled on her boots, and walked to Kaimura, the temple's red pagoda, glowing against the snow. The city was almost dreamlike that day. The crunch of snow underfoot, the breath of incense drifting from temple doors, the way people moved more slowly, careful not to slip. She stood at the temple's veranda, looking out over the white roofs of Kyoto, and felt a calm she hadn't expected. Her last week arrived quietly. She realized she'd stopped checking flight prices in idle moments. She'd stopped trying to fill every hour with movement. The days had become enough in themselves. Walking to the market, brewing tea, writing in her notebook as snow tapped against the window. On her final morning, she visited the rock garden once more. The snow had melted, but the air was still cold enough to make her breath visible. She sat again on the veranda, looking at the stones, and this time she didn't try to think about what they meant. She just let them be. It occurred to her then that this was the gift Kyoto had given her, the ability to sit with stillness without trying to turn it into something else. When she left the garden, she walked slowly back through the narrow streets, the winter light soft against the wooden facades. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. The idea was harmless enough. After Kyoto's winter stillness, Sarah felt ready for motion again, hungry for variety, for new streets under her feet. So she did what so many travelers do after a period of quiet. She overcompensated. Her plan was simple, at least on paper. 2 weeks in Bangkok, then a week in northern Thailand. A quick hop to Vietnam, with stops in Hanoi and Hoi An. A month in Bali to finish some projects, followed by a quick detour to Singapore before flying to Europe for spring. It was ambitious, and at first, it was exhilarating. Bangkok was a shock to the senses after Kyoto's careful quiet. The air was heavy with humidity, the streets alive with a symphony of honking tuk-tuks, sizzling woks, and voices layered over one another in a dozen languages. She threw herself into it, wandering night markets where the stalls glowed like lanterns in the dark, eating mango sticky rice from a street vendor while music thumped from a nearby bar, riding long-tail boats along the Chao Phraya River as the sun dipped low. But the pace she'd set for herself didn't allow for lingering. Just as she began to find her rhythm in Bangkok, it was time to pack up again. Chiang Mai was gentler, temples shaded by giant banyan trees, cafes tucked into leafy side streets, the air cooler in the evenings. She rented a bicycle and pedaled along the moat that ringed the old city, stopping to photograph golden stupas and stray cats sleeping in the sun. But even here, she felt the clock ticking. She spent mornings in co-working spaces, afternoons trying to see as much as possible. She was layering her days with sights, but her mind was already on the logistics of the next flight. By the time she reached Hanoi, the edges of fatigue had begun to fray her experience. The city was electric, motorbikes swarming like schools of fish, the air scented with strong coffee and grilled pork. She walked the narrow streets of the old quarter, ducking into shops where silk scarves and lacquerware gleamed under warm lights. But her senses felt dulled, like a camera lens smudged with fingerprints. She was still taking in the sights, but she wasn't absorbing them. Her journal entries became shorter, her photographs less inspired. One night, sitting in a small cafe as rain slicked the streets outside, she realized she'd been on the move for nearly 2 months without a pause longer than 3 days. Her body ached in that subtle, constant way that comes from never fully resting. Still, she pressed on. Hoi An was beautiful in the kind of way that draws postcards into being. Lanterns swaying over the river, markets spilling over with spices and fabrics, sunlight glinting off the yellow facades. She took a cooking class, cycled through rice paddies, and took hundreds of photographs. But inside, she was running on empty. Even small decisions, where to eat, what to see, began to feel heavy. She found herself choosing the familiar over the new simply because it was easier. Bali was supposed to be a rest stop. She booked a small villa with a pool, planning to stay put for a month, to work in the mornings and relax in the afternoons. For the first week, it worked. She swam under a sky so blue it looked unreal, ate fresh papaya for breakfast, and watched the sun set behind rice terraces. But then the work piled up. Deadlines she'd been putting off caught up with her. Internet issues turned simple tasks into hours of frustration. Friends messaged about meetups on other parts of the island, and she said yes to them all, unwilling to admit she needed to slow down. Her days filled again. The rest she'd promised herself slipped away. The breaking point came in Singapore. She planned just 4 days, enough time to wander hawker centers, visit the gardens by the bay, and maybe take a day trip to a nearby island. But on her second morning, she woke with a pounding headache, her limbs heavy as stone. She tried to push through, went to a cafe with her laptop, ordered coffee, opened her work. But the words on the screen blurred. Her mind was fogged, her body sending a message she could no longer ignore. She walked back to her hotel, drew the blackout curtains, and slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, it wasn't just physical exhaustion she felt. It was a kind of emptiness, the realization that she'd been moving so fast she hadn't really been anywhere. The joy she'd felt in earlier travels, the deep connection to a place, the sense of discovery, had been replaced by a checklist mentality. She'd been chasing stamps in her passport instead of moments that mattered. That afternoon, she sat at the small desk in her hotel room, notebook open, and wrote 3 questions. What do I want to feel when I travel? What pace allows me to feel that way? What am I afraid of missing if I slow down? The answers came slowly, but they came. She wanted depth over breadth. She wanted to leave a place knowing the smell of its morning air, the rhythm of its streets, the way the light fell at a certain time of day. And the thing she was afraid of missing wasn't a sight. It was the story she'd told herself about being a real traveler. That night, she canceled her next flight. Instead of heading straight to Europe, she booked a small guest house in Penang, Malaysia, for a full month. One city, one base, no rushing. She didn't tell anyone right away, not friends, not her online followers. This wasn't about making a public statement. It was about giving herself permission to rest. Penang turned out to be exactly what she needed. Her days slowed. She wandered the streets of Georgetown, photographing the street art in the morning light, lingering over bowls of laksa at roadside stalls, chatting with shop owners about their family histories. She worked when she needed to, but without the constant hum of urgency. By the end of the month, she felt the spark return, the one that made her notice the details, that made her journal fill with pages again. She learned the hard way that freedom wasn't about going as far or as fast as possible. It was about traveling at the speed of her own curiosity and letting herself stop before the joy ran dry. By the time Sarah left Penang, she had more than her energy back. She had clarity. The forced slowdown had done something she didn't expect. It gave her enough mental space to examine the thing that was quietly running her life more than any plane ticket or itinerary: her income. For nearly 2 years, she'd been supporting her travels through freelance work, mostly writing and content consulting for small businesses. It paid the bills, kept her moving, and let her work from anywhere. But it had also become the silent engine that determined her days. When deadlines piled up, she adjusted her travel plans, not the other way around. When a client asked for rush work, she said yes, even if it meant skipping an experience she'd been looking forward to. She told herself it was the price of freedom, that the trade-off was worth it. But in Penang, with its slow mornings and quiet afternoons, she started to see it differently. It began one humid evening, sitting on the balcony of her guest house with a bowl of shaved ice dessert and her laptop. She was reviewing her invoices, noting that 3 clients accounted for nearly 80% of her income. One of them, her highest payer, had started hinting at budget cuts. It hit her like a quiet alarm. Her freedom was only as stable as the contract she held, and those could vanish overnight. She began to ask herself a different set of questions than the one she'd written in Singapore. What would it look like to make my income more stable? What if I didn't have to take every project just to keep my schedule full? What would my work look like if it was designed for my life, instead of my life shaped around my work? The answers weren't simple, but one thing was clear: she needed to pivot. The first step was acceptance, acknowledging that the way she'd been working was reactive. She was saying yes to whatever came in, rather than intentionally building a business that fit the lifestyle she wanted. The second step was research. She started by reading everything she could about location-independent business models, scanning forums where digital nomads shared their income streams, taking notes on what might work for her skills. She kept coming back to 2 themes: build recurring income instead of one-off projects. Create something that could earn without constant hands-on effort. Sarah didn't have illusions about passive income. She knew it was rarely truly set and forget. But she saw a way she could shift her client work to include more retainer contracts, where she provide ongoing services for a fixed monthly fee. She also considered creating her own digital product, something that could sell while she slept, even if it took a lot of work up front. Back in her guest house room, she drew a simple diagram in her notebook. Current model: 90% freelance projects / 10% consulting calls. Goal model: 50% retainer clients / 30% digital products / 20% high-value consulting. She stared at it for a long time, letting the numbers sink in. It wasn't about working less. It was about working better. She gave herself 6 months to make the shift. Month 1 was about restructuring her current client base. She reached out to her best clients, the ones who paid on time, valued her work, and communicated clearly, and offered them a retainer option. In exchange for a slightly lower hourly rate, they'd get guaranteed hours each month, priority scheduling, and fewer surprise invoices. 2 said yes immediately. 1 needed convincing, but after Sarah explained how it would create consistency for both of them, they agreed to a trial. Month 2 was about cutting the projects that didn't serve her. This was harder. Saying no to paid work felt like breaking a survival rule. But she realized that every low-paying or high-stress project was stealing time she could use to build something more sustainable. She crafted a polite but firm message for these clients. Thank you for the opportunity to work together. My schedule is shifting toward longer-term commitments, so I won't be taking on new one-off projects. I can recommend other writers if you'd like. It was uncomfortable, but within a week, she felt lighter. Month 3 was about the digital product. She decided to create an online course for small business owners on how to create a content strategy that worked without burning out. It drew directly from her years of experience, both in her corporate past and as a freelancer. The course took weeks of planning, recording, editing, and building. She did most of it in the quiet early mornings before the heat of the day set in, often in the same cafe where the owner now knew her coffee order. By the end of the month, she had a beta version ready. She offered it at a discounted rate to her email list, asking for feedback. The responses were better than she'd hoped, and the sales, while not huge, proved the concept worked. By month 4, she began to feel the shift in her daily rhythm. Her mornings were no longer crammed with back-to-back deadlines. She had space to take a walk before opening her laptop, to linger over breakfast, to work on projects that mattered rather than just projects that paid. Her income was still uneven, but the retainer contracts covered her basic monthly expenses. The core sales added a small but growing stream on top. For the first time, she saw how her work could scale without her constantly chasing the next invoice. Month 5 was about refinement. She updated her website to reflect her new services, added a clear Work With Me page for retainers, and built a proper sales page for her course. She also started blocking out 1 day a week for her own business development. Not client work, not admin, but time to build the foundation for her future income streams. By month 6, the pivot was fully in motion. She was still working hard, but it was a different kind of hard. The frantic edge was gone. She could look at her calendar and see pockets of free time, space she could use to explore, to learn, to rest. She realized something that day in her favorite Penang cafe. Freedom wasn't just about having the ability to travel anywhere. It was about designing work that didn't chain her to her laptop, no matter where she was. She closed her notebook, took a sip of coffee, and smiled. She thought the pivot was about money. But really, it was about control, choosing how to spend her time instead of having it chosen for her. The first thing Sarah noticed was the space. Stepping out of the airport in North Carolina after almost 3 years abroad, the road seemed impossibly wide. The parking lot stretched, so far it shimmered in the late summer heat. Even the air felt bigger here, drier, less dense, without the tangled sense of street food or wood smoke or tropical flowers that had become the backdrop to her days. Her sister, Hannah, was waiting for her at the curb, leaning against a navy SUV. They hugged long and hard, Hannah pulling back only to look at her face like she was checking for changes. "You look lighter," Hannah said finally, "and tanner, and maybe a little like you've been living on mangoes." Sarah laughed, but she didn't explain. She wasn't sure yet how to translate the last 3 years into a single sentence. The drive to Hannah's house took them past familiar exits and chain restaurants, billboards advertising the same brand Sarah had grown up with. It was both comforting and jarring. The landscapes of her childhood hadn't changed much, but she had. At stoplights, she found herself glancing at the other drivers. Most stared ahead, hands wrapped around coffee cups, faces set in neutral masks. It reminded her of her own commuting years, the morning rush hour crawl to an office she'd once thought she'd retire from. The thought tightened something in her chest. Hannah's house was in a leafy suburb with wide lawns and neat rows of mailboxes. Inside, it smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon. A golden retriever bounded up to greet her, tail wagging so hard his whole body wiggled. They spent the first evening catching up over homemade pasta, trading stories about Hannah's kids and Sarah's travels. Sarah tried to explain Penang's street art, Kyoto's winter gardens, the chaos of Hanoi's motorbike traffic. Hannah listened with interest, but Sarah could tell some of it felt far away, like a dream belonging to someone else. The next morning, Sarah walked to a nearby cafe she used to frequent when she lived here. The menu was the same. The barista didn't recognize her. She ordered a latte and sat by the window, watching the steady stream of customers in business attire, earbuds in, phones in hand. It wasn't judgment she felt, more a quiet recognition. This was a life she could have still been living if she hadn't sold everything at 39. She might have been one of these people, shuffling in for caffeine before a meeting, checking the time to make sure she wasn't late. Over the next week, she slipped into old patterns without meaning to. She borrowed her sister's car, drove to the big box grocery store, picked up things in bulk because it felt cheaper. She caught herself zoning out in front of the TV in the evenings, defaulting to habits she thought she'd left behind. And she noticed something. The pace of life here was faster, even in the suburbs. People filled their schedules without thinking about it. Back-to-back commitments, errands stacked like dominoes, the constant hum of what's next rather than what's now. It wasn't better or worse, she decided, just different. But after years of shaping her own days, she felt the pull of that old current, and she wasn't sure she wanted to swim in it again. Her friends wanted to see her, of course. She met up with college classmates for dinner, visited an old co-worker for coffee, went to a backyard barbecue hosted by a couple she'd known since her 20s. The conversations were warm, but occasionally edged with disbelief. So, you just live out of a suitcase, and you don't own a house? Or a car? But what about, retirement? She answered as best she could, about her savings plan, her streamlined possessions, her income sources. But she could see that some people were filing her life under interesting but unrealistic. She didn't blame them. A few years ago, she might have thought the same. One afternoon, she drove past her old apartment complex on a whim. The brick buildings were the same, the parking lot full, the windows familiar. She parked on the street and sat for a moment, looking at the place where her before had happened. She could see herself, years younger, carrying groceries up the stairs, sorting mail at the kitchen counter, checking emails late into the night. The apartment had been tidy, comfortable, predictable. She'd decorated it in neutrals, telling herself it was timeless, but really it had been a reflection of how she felt back then, safe but stagnant. Now, she couldn't imagine living in one place for years at a time. About halfway through her visit, she began to feel a subtle tension. She loved being close to family again, but she also missed the small frictions of travel, figuring out new currencies, finding her way through unfamiliar streets, negotiating language barriers. Here, everything was easy, and that was both the gift and the danger. She realized that easy could slowly become automatic. Days could blend together until years passed without noticing. And for her, that was the thing she'd been running from. Not responsibility, but autopilot. Still, there were moments that anchored her. An afternoon spent baking cookies with her niece, both of them dusted in flour. A rainy morning curled up with her sister on the couch, drinking coffee and watching old movies. A long walk in the neighborhood where the scent of honeysuckle pulled her straight back to childhood summers. These were the things she didn't get on the road. Continuity, shared history, the comfort of being known without needing to explain yourself. Her final night, she and Hannah sat on the porch with glasses of wine. "You could always stay, Hannah said gently. "Find a place here. Be closer." Sarah smiled, looking out at the fireflies blinking in the yard. "I could," she said, and she meant it. But she also knew she wouldn't. "I love being here," she added. "But I love who I am out there, too." Hannah nodded, not pressing further. The morning she left, Sarah packed her single suitcase and backpack. It didn't take long. She brought only what she could carry, as always. Standing in the guest room, she realized that leaving didn't feel like it used to. It wasn't an escape or a leap into the unknown. It was just the next chapter, and she'd learned something important. She didn't need to reject her old life to keep living her new one. She could hold them both, the roots and the wings, without letting one smother the other. As the plane lifted off, she watched the landscape fall away, the grid of roads and houses shrinking into patterns. Somewhere over the clouds, she opened her journal and wrote, "Home isn't a place anymore. It's the way I choose to live." The idea started as a whisper. It came somewhere over the Atlantic, on the flight from North Carolina to Lisbon. Sarah was staring out at the endless sweep of ocean when the thought arrived, simple and clear. What if I stayed? Not forever. Not in the sense of buying a house or putting her name on a utility bill. But what if she stopped leaping every few months? What if she gave herself, in one place, the gift of time? For years, her life had been a string of short chapters. 3 months here, 6 weeks there, just long enough to learn the bus routes and recognize the faces at the market before packing it all into her suitcase again. She loved it, but she also wondered what she might be missing by never letting a place sink in her bones. Lisbon was the obvious choice. She'd passed through before, twice, briefly, and each time it felt a pull she couldn't quite explain. The city was a blend of things she craved: sun-warmed streets, a language she wanted to learn, an easy connection to other parts of Europe, and a pace of life that seemed to honor both work and leisure. But more than that, Lisbon felt like a place that could hold her without holding her down. She found an apartment in the Graca neighborhood, up one of those steep hills where the air smelled faintly of grilled sardines and laundry soap. The building was old, with tile facades chipped in places, but her unit was bright and airy, with a small balcony that overlooked a tangle of rooftops. The first morning, she stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, coffee in hand, listening to the city wake up, the rattle of the tram on the tracks below, the call of the bakery owner to the first customers, the gulls circling overhead. This was different, she realized. She wasn't listening as a visitor passing through. She was listening like someone who intended to remember this sound for months to come. Her experiment began with a commitment: 1 full year. No skipping off after a season. No treating it as a stopgap between bigger adventures. She wanted to see what happened when she let the novelty fade and life settle into something resembling a routine. The first month felt like any other arrival. New grocery stores to explore, new bus lines to memorize, new corners of the city to photograph. She walked everywhere, her camera slung over her shoulder, capturing pastel buildings and tiled staircases, bright yellow trams, and the river's changing moods. By month 2, she began to notice the shift. In her previous travels, this was usually when restlessness crept in. She'd have seen the main sights, found her favorite cafes, started browsing flights to somewhere new. But now, she leaned into the repetition. She shopped at the same Saturday market, greeting the fishmonger who remembered her preference for cod over sardines. She joined a Portuguese language class, meeting twice a week with the same small group, laughing over their shared mistakes. She even started a gym membership, something she hadn't done since selling her apartment years ago. The idea of signing up for anything that required an address had once felt absurd. Now, it felt like an anchor in the best sense. By month 3, the edges of novelty had worn down, revealing the subtler textures of daily life. She learned the trick of drying clothes on the balcony without them blowing into the neighbor's courtyard. She recognized a stray cat who liked to sun itself on the corner bench. She could navigate the winding streets without pulling out her phone. And somewhere in there, she stopped feeling like a visitor. Work was easier, too. With no travel days or constant transitions, she found her freelance schedule smoothing into a predictable rhythm. Mornings for deep work, afternoons for errands or exploring, evenings for classes or walks along the river. She noticed her income creeping upward, not because she was working more hours, but because she was working more efficiently. The energy she'd once spent adapting to new places now went into refining her business. Of course, staying put had its challenges. Around month 5, she hit what she started calling the gray zone, that flat middle stretch where the excitement of arrival had faded, but the deeper connections hadn't yet fully formed. It was easy to feel invisible here. Lisbon was friendly but not effusive, and many friendships among locals took time. She made acquaintances, classmates, neighbors she exchanged polite greetings with, but not yet the kind of relationships that led to spontaneous dinners or confidences shared over wine. For a week or 2, she felt the itch to leave. The old instinct rose up. Maybe I'll just take a quick trip. But she held her ground, reminding herself that the point of this year was to see what lay beyond that itch. And slowly, the connections began to deepen. The woman who owned the cafe downstairs started asking about her work, offering unsolicited but welcome Portuguese vocabulary lessons with each order. A fellow gym member invited her to a weekend hike. Her language class group began meeting outside of lessons for practice, which often turned into long, laughter-filled dinners. By month 7, her social calendar was full enough that she sometimes said no to invitations, something that had never happened in her faster-paced travel years. With stability came another surprise, a richer kind of learning. In the past, her understanding of a place had been like a snapshot, vivid but static. Now, it was more like a time-lapse, watching the city shift through seasons. She saw how the light changed in autumn, how the river grew moodier in winter, how the jacaranda trees exploded into purple bloom in spring. She noticed the festivals that didn't make it into guidebooks, the subtle changes in produce at the market, the way conversations in cafes turned toward football when certain matches approached. By month 9, she realized she'd stopped counting the months altogether. Life here wasn't a countdown anymore. It was just life. She knew which tram to take without checking a map, had a preferred stall at the market, knew which bakery's custard tarts were worth the extra walk. She also knew the small frustrations, the occasional slow bureaucracy, the sudden rain showers that could drench you in minutes, the tram delays that made you late no matter how early you left. But these had become part of the texture, rather than reasons to move on. When the 12th month arrived, she almost missed it. It wasn't until she sat on her balcony one evening, the river catching the last golden light of summer, that she realized the year was up. She'd done it. A full year in one place for the first time since leaving her old life behind. And in that moment, she understood something she couldn't have learned in shorter stays. Freedom didn't mean constant movement. Sometimes, it meant the freedom to stop. The next morning, she packed her bag. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to see where the road might lead again. But this time, she carried more than her suitcase. She carried the knowledge that she could root herself when she chose to, and that those roots could make her wings stronger. Sarah had been in Lisbon for almost a year when she first met Alex. It was at a co-working space near Cais do Soter, a sunlit loft with exposed brick walls, long wooden tables, and the smell of espresso drifting from the cafe corner. She'd gone there to work on the final edits of her online course, a quiet, focused day with headphones in. But Alex had other plans. He sat down at the far end of her table, tall and lean, with windblown brown hair and the easy confidence of someone used to introducing himself to strangers. Within minutes, he'd struck up a conversation. He was a Canadian web developer who'd been living a nomadic life for 6 years, running an agency that helped small businesses build their online presence. "You're a writer?" he asked when she mentioned her work. "Ever thought about combining forces with a developer?" She smiled politely, the way she always did when someone floated a casual collaboration idea. "I usually work solo," she said, leaving it there. But over the next few weeks, they kept running into each other, at the co-working space, at a language exchange night, even in line at the market once. Conversations stretched longer. She learned he'd built his business to the point where he only needed to work 20 hours a week, spending the rest of his time surfing or traveling. He learned she'd just finished restructuring her own income streams and was looking for ways to expand without sacrificing her freedom. It was during one of those conversations, over cappuccinos at an outdoor cafe, that Alex leaned forward and said, "I think we could build something pretty powerful together." The idea was simple at first. A joint venture creating turnkey websites with built-in content strategies for small business owners who didn't have the time or skills to do it themselves. He'd handle the design and technical build. She'd craft the messaging, brand voice, and content plan. They could sell the packages online, with a clear process and premium pricing. On paper, it made sense. They each had skills the other lacked, and their styles seemed complementary, his analytical precision balancing her narrative intuition. Still, Sarah hesitated. For years, her independence had been her shield. She answered to no one, set her own pace, made decisions without waiting for approval. She worried that a partnership could chip away at that freedom, that shared responsibility might start to feel like a chain. But she also saw the potential. If it worked, it could become a significant new income stream for both of them. And maybe, just maybe, it could teach her something about collaboration that she'd been avoiding. She agreed to a 1-month trial. The first week was electric. They worked from the co-working space most days, huddled over laptops, trading ideas in a rapid-fire rhythm. Alex built prototypes while she drafted content outlines. She'd read aloud copy that made them both laugh, and he'd tweak a design element until it clicked into place. In the evenings, they'd walk along the river, talking about everything from pricing strategies to the best pastries in Lisbon. It felt easy, natural, like finding a creative partner she didn't know she'd been missing. By week 3, the cracks began to show. They had different working rhythms. She liked to start early, hitting her most focused hours before lunch. He preferred late mornings, and often hit his stride at night. She wanted to move quickly, launching their first client project within a month. He wanted to perfect every detail before releasing anything. Emails from potential clients sometimes sat in his inbox for days. Her instinct was to respond immediately. His was to wait until he had the perfect answer. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting where they'd gone in circles about timelines, Sarah walked to the waterfront alone. She sat on a stone bench, watching the ferries cross the river, and asked herself whether this was worth it. Her instinct was to protect her autonomy, to walk away before resentment grew. But she also knew that part of the point of this trial was to see if she could stretch, not just in business, but in patience, communication, and compromise. That evening, she suggested they meet somewhere outside of work to talk. They ended up in a tiny wine bar with candlelit tables, where she told him honestly how she was feeling, that the delays frustrated her, that she was used to relying only on herself, that she was afraid of losing control over her own work pace. Alex listened quietly, then admitted he was worried about burning out if they moved too fast. He'd built his lifestyle around avoiding the kind of overwork that had crushed him in his 20s. In that moment, she realized they weren't clashing because they had different goals. They were clashing because they were afraid of the same thing: losing the freedom they'd worked so hard to create. They agreed to a new system. She'd handle all initial client communications within 24 hours, keeping momentum going, while he'd take ownership of setting realistic timelines for the build phase. They also decided to check in twice a week specifically about workflow, not just project details, a space to voice concerns before they became roadblocks. The changes worked. By the end of the month, they completed their first full project, a clean, professional site with a content plan that the client raved about. Word of mouth brought 2 more inquiries within a week, and Sarah found herself enjoying something she hadn't expected: the relief of not having to do everything alone. When a design problem came up, it was Alex's to solve. When a tricky bit of copy needed work, it was hers. They each stayed in their zone of genius, trusting the other to handle theirs. Over the next few months, the venture grew steadily. They kept their own separate work and travel schedules, meeting in person when they were in the same city, working remotely when they weren't. The partnership didn't replace her solo business. It added to it, giving her another income stream without consuming all her time. But more than the money, it gave her a new perspective. That freedom didn't have to mean doing everything alone. Sometimes, the right collaboration could expand her world instead of shrinking it. One afternoon, months later, she and Alex met for coffee in Barcelona, where their paths had crossed again. "Still glad we tried this?" he asked. Sarah smiled, thinking of the year before, when she'd been so certain partnerships weren't for her. "Yeah," she said. "Turns out, I just needed the right one." It started quietly. One afternoon in Valencia, Sarah was sitting at a sun-dappled table outside her favorite cafe when an email arrived from an old client. The subject line read, "Urgent project. Need you this week." 3 years ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. She would have cleared her calendar, worked late into the night, and felt secretly flattered that they still came to her when the stakes were high. But now, she hesitated. Her schedule wasn't empty. She had a trip planned to a nearby village festival, a language exchange on Thursday night, and a promise to herself to take Friday entirely offline. She also knew that urgent usually meant chaotic, and chaotic rarely aligned with her best work. She typed a polite but firm reply. "Thanks for thinking of me, but I'm fully booked this week and not taking rush projects right now." She pressed send, and then she sat back, feeling something unusual. Not guilt, not panic, relief. That small moment was the first stone in what became a larger shift. She began noticing how much of her time and energy over the years had been spent on reflexive yes. Yes to extra client work because it felt irresponsible to turn down income. Yes to side trips with other travelers because she feared missing out. Yes to social obligations, even when she wanted a quiet night in. In her early days of travel, those yes had opened doors. They'd led to opportunities, friendships, and experiences she wouldn't trade for anything. But she was beginning to see that there was a tipping point, a place where saying yes too often didn't expand her life anymore. It thinned it. The realization came into sharper focus one rainy Tuesday, in Valencia. She had agreed to help a new acquaintance with their website, just a few hours, they'd said, in exchange for dinner. That few hours turned into a full day of troubleshooting broken plugins and rewriting badly written copy, while the other person popped in and out to run errands. By evening, Sarah was exhausted, her own work untouched. Dinner turned out to be takeout pizza, eaten while they scrolled through their phones. Walking home through the wet streets, she felt the weight of it. She'd given her entire day to something she didn't care about, for no reason other than not wanting to seem unhelpful. The next morning, she opened her notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What I will no longer say yes to." The list started small. Rush projects with no extra pay. Casual work favors for acquaintances. Social invitations that feel like obligations. Then it grew. Long-term commitments that don't align with my goals. Trips planned entirely around someone else's schedule. Clients who drain more energy than they're worth. By the time she capped her pen, the list filled an entire page. She didn't see it as a rejection of opportunities. She saw it as curation. The first test came a week later. A fellow digital nomad she'd met in Lisbon messaged her, "Hey, thinking of renting a villa in Bali for a month with a group." 3 years ago, she'd have booked a flight immediately. This time, she thought about it for a full day. She weighed the cost, the disruption to her current projects, and, maybe most importantly, the fact that she didn't actually enjoy long-term group living. She wrote back, "Sounds amazing, but not for me this time." Her friend replied with a thumbs-up emoji and moved on. Sarah closed her laptop, marveling at how anticlimactic it felt. The fear of disappointing someone had once kept her from saying no. But the truth was, most people didn't care as much as she imagined. Work was where the change felt most profound. In the past, her freelance income had felt fragile, so she'd said yes to almost every offer. Now, with multiple income streams, retainer clients, her online course, and the small but steady revenue from her partnership with Alex, she had the breathing room to be selective. She began raising her rates for one-off projects. The result was immediate. Fewer projects, but each one better paid and better aligned with her skills. Clients who balked at the price quietly disappeared. The ones who stayed valued her work more. The biggest challenge was social boundaries. As a solo traveler, Sarah had learned to be open to connection, to say yes to dinners, tours, and impromptu adventures. But now she realized she'd been carrying a subtle fear that if she declined too often, she'd end up alone. In Valencia, she tested that fear. One Friday night, a group from her co-working space invited her to a bar crawl. She liked them well enough, but she was craving solitude. She thanked them and said she was staying in a read. The next week, they invited her to a tapas night. She went, and the conversation flowed as if nothing had happened. The fear dissolved. Real friendships could handle a no. Over the next few months, she began treating no as a form of budgeting, not of money, but of energy. She noticed the ripple effects. Her work quality improved. Her mornings felt calmer. She had time to take a ceramics class she'd been eyeing for weeks. She wandered through the city's botanical gardens on a Tuesday afternoon, lingering in the glass house just because she could. Her yes became more deliberate. They were yes she felt in her chest, not just ones that slipped out of her mouth before she'd thought them through. But there was still one yes she was struggling to unlearn, the yes to old habits. In early spring, a long-term client asked her to take on a project outside their normal scope. It was high-paying, but came with tight deadlines and late-night calls. She agreed automatically, telling herself it was just for a few weeks. By the end of the month, she was drained, skipping her language classes and living on coffee and sandwiches. One night, she caught herself scrolling aimlessly on her phone at 1 a.m., the open laptop beside her, and realized she'd recreated the exact grind she'd worked so hard to escape. She emailed the client the next day, declining any future work of that type. It was uncomfortable, but the moment she hit send, she felt the weight lift. Her season of saying no didn't make her life smaller. It made it sharper. With fewer distractions, her days felt both lighter and richer. She had more time for deep conversations, for focused creative work, for travel that wasn't rushed. She noticed more of the cities she stayed in, because she wasn't always racing from one obligation to the next. And somewhere in there, she realized she'd stumbled into a new definition of freedom. Not just the ability to choose, but the ability to refuse. The decision to head south came on a rainy afternoon in Valencia. Sarah was in a small bookstore near the train station, idly flipping through a coffee table book of world photography. She stopped on a page showing the salt flats of Bolivia, endless white merging with a sky so blue it looked impossible. She closed the book, but couldn't shake the image. Within a week, she had booked a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires. It wasn't an impulse in the old sense. She had no desire to dash across an entire continent in a blur. This trip would be different. This would be the slow road. Buenos Aires greeted her in early autumn. The air was warm, but carried the faint bite of approaching winter. Tree-lined avenues stretched for blocks, their leaves just beginning to turn gold. She rented a small apartment in San Telmo. High ceilings, worn wooden floors, a balcony that overlooked a cobblestone street. Tango music floated up from a bar on the corner most nights. Her first days were filled with the pleasure of settling in, buying vegetables from the same vendor each morning, learning to order coffee the Argentine way, un café con leche, por favor, wandering through the antique markets on Sundays. It was tempting to start plotting the entire continent right away. But she resisted. She reminded herself, the point of this trip was not to see everything. The point was to experience each place long enough to feel its rhythms. She stayed in Buenos Aires for nearly 2 months, long enough to know which bus routes were most reliable, long enough to recognize the smell of fresh medialunas drifting from the bakery 3 doors down, long enough to have real conversations with locals in her halting Spanish, conversations that went beyond the surface-level exchanges of a tourist. Her work schedule adjusted easily to Argentine time. Mornings for writing, afternoons for exploring, evenings for mate with neighbors who had taken her under their wing. When she finally moved on, it wasn't because she felt restless. It was because she felt ready. From Buenos Aires, she took a bus north to Córdoba, then further into the mountains of Mendoza. The buses were long and the road sometimes rough, but the landscapes unspooled in slow, cinematic frames, rolling vineyards, jagged peaks, vast plains under skies that seemed to stretch forever. In Mendoza, she rented a bicycle and spent lazy afternoons riding between vineyards, sipping Malbec under shade trees. In the evenings, she cooked in the small kitchen of her guest house, the windows open to let in the scent of wood smoke from nearby houses. There was a quiet satisfaction in these days, in cooking her own meals, in spending less than she might have in Europe, in finding joy in the simplest pleasures. Crossing into Chile, she stayed in Valparaiso for nearly 6 weeks. The city was a labyrinth of steep hills and bright murals, stray dogs sleeping in doorways, and cafes tucked into unlikely corners. She began to notice the financial side of slow travel more clearly here. By staying longer in each place, she can negotiate better rental rates, shop at local markets instead of eating out, and avoid the constant expense of buses, flights, and tours. Her daily costs were half what they'd been when she moved every few weeks. She kept a spreadsheet, nothing fancy, just a way to see the numbers in black and white, and the difference was undeniable. She crossed into Bolivia slowly, taking a train to Uni. The salt flats were even more surreal in person than they had been in the photograph. She stayed 3 nights in a small guest house run by a family who also farmed quinoa. They invited her to join them for meals, serving steaming bowls of soup and fresh bread while the wind howled outside. Here, there was no rushing. The landscape demanded stillness. Standing in that vast, white expanse, horizon melting into sky, she felt the same calm she'd found on her quietest days in Lisbon. That rare sense that nothing needed to happen for the moment to be complete. La Paz was another kind of lesson. The city was chaotic, loud, and exhilarating, perched high in the mountains with streets that seemed to run at impossible angles. She rented a room in a shared apartment and quickly learned the unspoken rules of living with strangers, shared chores, rotating cooking nights, the art of balancing privacy with connection. The apartment's internet was unreliable, which forced her to work offline more often. At first, she found this frustrating, but soon she realized that without constant notifications, she worked faster and felt calmer. From Bolivia, she drifted into Peru. Cusco became her base for nearly 3 months. Here, she fell into a steady pattern. Mornings writing in a cafe near the Plaza de Armas, afternoons wandering the narrow streets or taking day trips to nearby ruins, evenings watching the light fade over the mountains. She learned to make decisions with both her calendar and her bank account in mind. She'd weigh each potential trip, not just the cost of the ticket or hotel, but the disruption to her work and the trade-off in lost days of quiet routine. It wasn't about denying herself experiences. It was about choosing the ones that mattered most. One weekend, she took a train to Machu Picchu. The site was everything she'd imagined: grand, mysterious, breathtaking. But she was equally moved by a small, unplanned moment later that day. She was walking back to her guest house in Aguas Calientes when she passed a group of children playing soccer in the street. They invited her to join. She kicked the ball once, twice, and suddenly she was laughing, chasing it barefoot in the fading light, her bag tossed to the side. It reminded her that the magic of travel wasn't always in the bucket list destinations. Sometimes it was in the seconds that slipped in between them. By the time she reached Ecuador, her slow travel rhythm felt natural. In Quito, she found a tiny apartment with a view of the mountains and a kitchen just big enough for one. She spent her days working on a new e-book about financial freedom and slow living, drawing on her recent experiences. Her expenses were lower than they'd been in years, her income steady, her sense of time expansive. She realized that the slow road wasn't just about money or even about travel style. It was about allowing herself to go deep, into a place, into her work, into herself. When she finally reached Colombia, she stayed in Medellin for nearly 4 months. By now, she had a rhythm she trusted. She'd arrive, settle in for weeks or months, make a short list of experiences she wanted, then let the rest emerge naturally. She noticed how much more connected she felt to each city when she wasn't rushing through it. She could return to the same cafe enough times to be recognized, enough to notice when the barista had a new haircut or when the corner shop changed its window display. The slow road had another gift. It allowed her to see her own growth in real time. 3 years ago, she would have filled her days with constant movement, worried that slowing down meant wasting time. Now, she saw that slowing down was the only way to make time feel abundant. Standing on her balcony in Medellin one evening, the city spread out below in a sea of lights, she felt a quiet certainty. She would never travel the way she once had. This deliberate, spacious, intentional pace was how she wanted to live. The first seed was planted in a small cafe in Medellin. Sarah had been working on her laptop, polishing the latest chapter of her ebook about slow travel and financial freedom. A young woman at the next table leaned over and asked in hesitant English, "Are you writing a book?" Sarah smiled, trying to. The woman, whose name was Camila, explained that she dreamed of leaving her office job to work remotely, but didn't know where to start. She'd been following travel blogs for years, but most seemed to gloss over the hard parts. "They only show beaches," Camila said, laughing softly. "They don't tell you how to make it possible." Sarah closed her laptop and spent the next hour answering her questions about budgeting, finding freelance clients, choosing destinations, and avoiding burnout. When Camila left, she hugged Sarah tightly. "You should teach this," she said. Sarah walked home that evening with those words echoing in her head. "You should teach this." It wasn't a new idea. Over the years, people had often asked her for advice on travel, remote work, or simplifying life. She'd shared tips here and there, written the occasional blog post, even created her online course. But something about Camila's earnestness, the way she'd scribbled notes on a napkin, stirred something deeper. Sarah began to wonder if she'd been treating her own story too lightly. What if all these years of travel, of trial and error, of learning to navigate both finances and freedom, could become something lasting? That night, she pulled out her old journals. There were stacks of them, tucked in the bottom of her suitcase and stored in digital files. Pages filled with first impressions of cities, budget breakdowns, lists of lessons learned after botched trips, emotional reflections on loneliness and joy. She began reading through them, one by one. In the earliest entries, she heard the voice of the woman who had just sold everything and stepped into the unknown, eager, a little reckless, sometimes overwhelmed. As the months passed, the voice shifted, steadier, more deliberate, wiser without losing its curiosity. It was all there, not just the places she'd been, but the transformation that had happened along the way. The idea of a larger project began to take shape. She imagined a book that wasn't just a memoir or a travelogue, but a guide, weaving her personal journey with practical, actionable advice. Each chapter could tell a story and then break it down. How she'd budgeted for that leg of the trip, what mistakes she'd made, how she'd handled the logistics, and what she'd learned. It would be honest about both the beauty and the messiness. And it would speak to people like Camila, who needed more than a filtered snapshot. But the book wasn't enough. As she brainstormed, she realized she wanted multiple layers to this legacy. A podcast where she could interview other travelers and entrepreneurs. A library of free resources, budget templates, packing lists, guides to building a portable career. And maybe, someday, a mentorship program for people who wanted to take their first steps into a freer life. It felt ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But she reminded herself, every big thing she'd done had started as something small. She began dedicating part of each day to building this legacy project, as she started calling it in her notes. Mornings were for writing the book. Afternoons, she recorded short audio segments, stories from her travels, tips she'd learned the hard way. Evenings, she drafted outlines for free guides she could post online. She kept her tone practical but warm, always circling back to her central belief that freedom wasn't about running away from life, but about building one you didn't need to escape. Financially, she treated it like any other venture. She set a budget, allocating a portion of her savings to cover a new microphone, website hosting, and a designer for the book cover. She tracked expenses carefully, reminding herself that while this might not earn money immediately, it was an investment in something bigger than her current income streams. The discipline she'd learned from years of travel budgeting carried over seamlessly. She knew how to spend deliberately, how to cut costs elsewhere to fund what mattered most. One afternoon, while editing a podcast episode, she caught herself smiling. It wasn't just about helping others. It was also about claiming her own story, shaping it in a way that gave meaning to the years she'd spent wandering. She realized she'd been afraid of this step for a long time, afraid that sharing too much would make her vulnerable, that putting her story into the world would invite judgment. But now, she felt something stronger than fear, the sense that this was the work she was meant to do. In Medellin, she began hosting small, informal meetups. She'd post a note in a local digital Nomad group, coffee and conversation about remote work, anyone welcome. The first time, only 3 people came. They sat in a sunny courtyard cafe, swapping stories about clients, visas, and favorite travel hacks. The second time, there were 7. By the 4th meetup, she had to push tables together. People came from all walks of life: graphic designers, English teachers, software developers, writers. Some were veterans of the road, others were just beginning. But all were hungry for connection and for real talk about the practical side of this lifestyle. It was during one of these gatherings that she met Javier, a Colombian videographer who had been traveling part-time for years. He offered to help her create short video clips from her meetups and podcast recordings. "Stories are stronger with faces," he said. Sarah agreed. Together, they shot footage of her walking through local markets, working in cafes, and speaking to small groups. The videos gave her project a new dimension, one that could reach people scrolling through social media, stopping them long enough to listen. By the time she left Medellin, her project had momentum. The book manuscript was halfway done. She had 6 podcast episodes scheduled. The free resources were live on her website, and emails were trickling in from strangers saying things like, "I've been dreaming of this for years. Your story makes me feel like it's possible." On her last night in the city, she stood on her balcony, watching the lights spread across the valley. She thought about all the places she'd lived, all the versions of herself she'd been in those places. The travels had given her a life she loved. But now, she saw that the real gift was this: the ability to pass that possibility on to someone else. She didn't know how far the project would go, how many people it would reach, or what form it might take in 5 years. But she knew one thing. She wanted to keep building it, piece by piece, for as long as it felt alive in her hands. And maybe, someday, long after she'd stopped traveling, it would still be out there, helping someone like Camila step into a freer life. That, she thought, would be the best kind of legacy. It happened in Oaxaca. She had come for the colors, the the terracotta walls, the bright hand-woven textiles, the vivid blue sky. She stayed for the rhythm, slow mornings, market afternoons, warm evenings filled with the scent of chocolate, and chili drifting from kitchens. Oaxaca in late spring was generous with its light. The sun seemed to linger a little longer over the mountains, and each evening, the streets glowed amber. Sarah had rented a small casita on the edge of town, with whitewashed walls, a tiled patio, and a lemon tree in the courtyard. At first, she thought of it as just another stop. But within 2 weeks, something shifted. One morning, she was sitting on the patio with a cup of coffee, the lemon tree casting dappled shadows over her journal. She realized she had stopped thinking about where she would go next. The itch to move, always a low hum in the background, had gone quiet. She had been traveling for nearly 6 years. She had learned to adapt to constant change, to make anywhere feel like home for a while. But here, the thought of staying longer didn't feel like settling. It felt like breathing out. Still, she didn't speak it aloud at first. There was a superstition in her, maybe from all those years of moving, that naming something too soon might scare it away. So she let the thought sit quietly in the corner of her mind while she went about her days. She worked from the same cafe most mornings, greeted by name by the barista. She learned the shortcut to the market that passed under flowering jacaranda trees. She started a small herb garden in pots on the patio. She could picture herself here, not just for weeks, but for seasons. The idea of a home base wasn't new. Over the years, she'd met other long-term travelers who had eventually chosen one. A small apartment in Chiang Mai, a cottage in Portugal, a cabin in the mountains of Colorado. They all said the same thing, that having a home base didn't mean the end of travel, only a new way of doing it. Trips became chapters, not entire books. Sarah had always nodded politely, but inside she'd felt resistant. A home base sounded like a commitment she wasn't ready for. But now, in Oaxaca, she began to see it differently. It started with a question she wrote in her journal. What does freedom mean to me now? When she'd started traveling, freedom meant not being tied down. It meant the ability to pack up in a day and be gone. But that version of freedom had changed. Now, it meant choosing where she wanted to be and staying there if she wished. It meant not moving because she had to, but because she wanted to, and maybe, she thought, it meant having a place that was entirely hers. Financially, it was possible. Years of careful budgeting, diversified income streams, and living below her means had built her savings to a point where buying a small property wouldn't be reckless. She could even do it without touching her emergency fund. She started to run numbers, just as she had when deciding whether to sell her belongings all those years ago. She researched property prices in Oaxaca and a few other cities she loved. She looked into maintenance costs, taxes, the logistics of renting it out when she was away. She kept her spreadsheet factual, but in the back of her mind, emotion was creeping in. Her heart knew the decision was bigger than money. It was about identity. She had become Sarah, the nomad, the woman who had sold everything at 39 and built a life on the road. What would it mean to her story if she stopped moving? Would people see it as the end of her adventure? Would she see it that way? One evening, she walked into the Zocalo at sunset, the square alive with music and the smell of roasted corn. She sat on a bench and watched children chase each other. Old men play chess, couples share street food. It occurred to her that these people weren't living smaller lives because they stayed in one place. They were simply living them differently. The turning point came on a Sunday morning. She was in the kitchen, barefoot, making coffee. A breeze carried in the smell of tortillas, cooking somewhere nearby. Outside, the lemon tree was heavy with fruit. She felt a wave of belonging, so sudden it startled her. It wasn't the intense rush of arriving somewhere new. It was quieter, steadier, the feeling of roots. And in that moment, she knew. Having a home base wouldn't be the end of her freedom. It would be the foundation for it. That afternoon, she called Alex, her business partner from the joint venture, to talk it through. "You sound like you already decided," he said after listening to her reasons. "Maybe I have," she admitted. He laughed. "Then the only question is where." She gave herself permission to take her time. Over the next few months, she visited a handful of cities she loved, imagining life there not as a visitor, but as a resident. She asked herself practical questions. Could she work here easily? Were there communities she could join? Did the cost of living fit her long-term budget? But she also asked the quieter questions. Did she feel at peace here? Could she picture herself walking these streets in the rain? Oaxaca kept coming back to the top of the list. By late summer, she was sitting in a small real estate office near the cathedral, looking over photos of homes. She wasn't in a rush. She wanted something modest, low maintenance, with space for a garden and a small office. The agent, a woman named Marisol, listened carefully and promised to keep an eye out. Walking back through the narrow streets afterward, Sarah felt both the weight and lightness of what she was doing. This was the kind of decision she couldn't have made at 39 when she'd first set out. Not financially, not emotionally. But now, she had both the means and the clarity. The search would take time. She wasn't in a hurry. That was the beauty of it. She could take her time, knowing that every step toward this decision was one she had chosen freely. She didn't know exactly when she'd find the right place, but she knew she would. And when she did, it wouldn't mark the end of her journey. It would simply mark the next chapter. The rains came to Oaxaca in early September. They would roll in during the late afternoon, clouds gathering over the mountains until the sky cracked open and the streets shimmered under silver sheets. The scent of earth and citrus rose from the ground, and for an hour or so, the whole city seemed to pause. Sarah loved these moments. She would sit on the covered patio of her casita, a cup of tea in hand, listening to the steady percussion of rain on the roof tiles. The lemon tree leaves would tremble under the downpour, and somewhere beyond the courtyard wall, she'd hear the sound of a neighbor's laughter. It was in one of those rain-soaked afternoons that she realized the story she had been living all these years was finally ready to be named. When she'd left at 39, freedom had meant one thing: escape. Escape from the 9-to-5 office walls, from the cycle of rent and bills, from the predictable treadmill she'd been walking for nearly 2 decades. Her vision of freedom had been a blank map and the ability to fill it with whatever she wanted. In those first months, the thrill of that blankness was intoxicating. Each flight, each bus ride, each unfamiliar street felt like proof that she had made the right choice. But looking back now, she could see that her early version of freedom was also fragile. It depended on constant movement, on novelty, on the absence of ties. It was freedom defined by what she was avoiding. It had taken years and hundreds of small, unglamorous choices to shape a different kind of freedom. The budgeting systems she had refined in Lisbon. The decision to say no to certain kinds of work in Valencia. The rhythm she'd learned in South America of staying long enough to know the street vendors by name. The legacy project she'd begun in Medellin. And now, the decision to root part of herself in Oaxaca. These were not the things that fit into Instagram captions. They were the foundation stones of a life that felt steady enough to carry her wherever she wanted to go. She thought about the word free as she had understood it at different ages. At 20, free meant being untethered, wild, and unaccountable to anyone. At 30, free meant financial security, enough savings to avoid panic. At 39, when she sold everything, free meant the power to walk away. But here, on the edge of 45, she realized something she might not have believed back then. That true freedom wasn't the absence of constraints. It was the ability to choose your constraints wisely. One evening, she met a friend for dinner, Javier, the videographer she'd worked with in Medellin, who was now passing through Oaxaca. They sat at a long wooden table in a mezcaleria, the air fragrant with roasted agave. Over small plates of grilled vegetables and mole, he asked her, "Do you think you'll stop traveling now, once you have your place?" She considered the question. "No," she said finally, "but I think I'll travel differently. More like chapters instead of an endless sentence." He laughed. "And the book you're writing?" "That," she said, smiling, "feels like it's just beginning." The book had taken on a life of its own. What had started as an idea in Medellin was now almost complete. She had woven her stories with practical guidance, pages on budgeting, negotiating rent, building portable income, and maintaining a sense of home on the road. In writing it, she'd realized she wasn't just documenting her journey. She was writing the book she wished she'd had when she started. Something that didn't romanticize the lifestyle, but also didn't flatten it into a list of tips. Something that told the truth about both the struggles and the rewards. She had a title in mind, though she wasn't ready to share it yet. It felt like a secret between her and the pages. Her days in Oaxaca began to take on a gentle rhythm. Mornings were for writing. She would set her phone aside, brew a pot of coffee, and sit at the small desk in her bedroom, the lights spilling in from the courtyard. Afternoons, she'd walk into town, sometimes for errands, sometimes just to wander. She'd stop at her favorite cafe to edit a chapter or answer emails. On certain days, she met with Marisol, the real estate agent, to look at potential houses. Evenings were for friends, for cooking, for slow conversations under the courtyard lights. She noticed how different this rhythm felt from the constant motion of her early years, and she realized she liked it. But she also noticed something else. The wanderlust was still there. Every so often, she'd see a photograph of a place she'd never been. A windswept coast in Scotland, a market in Morocco, a train through Vietnam, and feel the familiar pull. The difference now was that she didn't feel compelled to book a ticket immediately. She could let the longing sit, knowing it would be there when the right time came. This was a kind of freedom she'd never had before, the freedom to wait. One Sunday, during the late afternoon rain, she sat at her desk and wrote herself a letter. It began, "Dear Sarah at 39. She told her younger self about the years ahead, the city she would love, the mistakes she would make, the friendships that would change her life. She told her about the times she would be afraid, and how each one would pass. She told her that money would be tight some months, abundant in others, and that she would learn to ride both waves with calm. She told her that one day, she would stop running, not because she was tired, but because she had found a place worth pausing for. And she ended with this: you will come to understand that freedom is not about doing everything. It's about knowing what matters enough to keep and letting the rest go." By the time she finished the letter, the rain had stopped. The sky had turned the color of ripe mango, and the scent of wet earth filled the courtyard. She left the letter folded on her desk, knowing she'd read it again someday. In the weeks that followed, she kept working on the book and the podcast. She recorded an episode titled Redefining Freedom, where she talked openly about her decision to create a home base. She was nervous about how listeners would react, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. People wrote to her saying they felt less pressure to keep moving in their own travels, that her words had given them permission to find their own balance. It struck her that the version of freedom she now lived might resonate even more than the one she'd started with. Because it wasn't about a single dramatic leap. It was about the slow, steady work of building a life that fit. The day she signed the papers for her house, the sky was impossibly clear. It wasn't a grand property, just a small adobe home with 2 bedrooms, a courtyard, and space for her herb garden. But when she stepped inside, she felt the same quiet certainty she'd felt under the lemon tree months before. This would be her anchor, not a chain, but a compass point, a place to return to between journeys. That evening, she sat on the patio, the keys cool in her palm, and thought about the arc of her story. From selling everything she owned in her London flat to buying a home in Mexico. From chasing constant novelty to choosing deliberate stillness. From defining freedom as escape to defining it as presence. She thought about all the people she'd met along the way, the lessons they'd given her, the versions of herself she'd lived through. And she felt something rare and complete, a sense of arrival that didn't mean the end of movement, only a deeper kind of traveling.